All right, keep on going.
The
Mr. Chris
llama.
Culbertson, your runner-up of the Big Bass bracket last year.
And Culbertson, you are going to go up against
Cody Holmes. Cody and Chris in a week 1 matchup. That's a good one there.
What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Doc Talk. My name is Christopher Culbertson, and today I am coming to you from a cabin in northern Michigan where we've come to get away from everything for just a little bit. Today we'll be taking a look at weather and how weather impacts bass fishing. The weather during the springtime can be different almost day to day, so you really have to keep an eye on what's going on in the weather and how this is going to impact the fishing conditions on your lake. For example, right now in northern Michigan, a lot of the lakes around us are frozen, and when we first came up there was snow, and then it started to melt. We had a rainy day yesterday, and you would think that we were seeing another springtime coming up, but then today it's back to snowing and cold again. As we start tournament fishing in the spring, it's so important that we all keep an eye on the weather, and it's so important to understand how this changing weather conditions will impact fishing on your lake. One of the first tournaments that most of us are involved in is called the Michigan Big Bass Bracket, which is a really fun bracket. It's pretty low stakes depending on how you take it. But one of the things I learned last year during the Michigan Big Bass Bracket was pre-spawn and springtime fishing and how the weather plays into a run towards a championship. Now, in many ways, I feel pretty lucky that I got to be runner-up in the Michigan Big Bass Championship. I was fishing in Southeast Michigan, and in Southeast Michigan, I was constantly looking at the weather to find out what might have been the best day to fish that week. And there were several times last bracket where storms came in, cold fronts came in, and made weekend fishing conditions very, very difficult. And I was talking to Eric Polens, who reminded me you can still catch fish in cold conditions. I remember he posted a bass in the snow. He caught a smallmouth, I think it was, in the snow, which was really cool, but just shows you the level of expertise that a lot of these anglers have. And so for me starting out, it was really important to understand, how he caught that fish in the cold and in the snow, and why I was doing so well before cold fronts and before storms moved in. I think it's important to also note that I didn't do very well in the springtime period last time for our tournaments. There were 2 or 3 tournaments where I didn't catch any fish during a tournament. And so it's something that I kind of have a chip on my shoulder entering this springtime. And I've done a lot of research in the off season to try to understand which baits you should be throwing. One of the first things you're probably experiencing when it comes to fishing in the springtime is windy conditions. Now, windy conditions can impact your lake in many different ways, including air temperature, water temperature, and water clarity. Fishing in the wind can really be a pain in the ass for a lot of kayak fishermen, especially because it all plays into how you're setting up your boat position, casting into versus with versus alongside the wind. There's so many things to think about when fishing in the wind. Wind tends to break up the surface of the water. It adds a little bit of chop, a little bit of noise. It'll kick up things that are in the water from the bottom of the lake. Sometimes you'll hear people complaining about leaves being kicked up and sticks floating around because that water is very turbulent. Some of the baits that I've been reading about to use are moving baits and reaction baits. A lot of times when the lake is kicking up or the wind is making the water churn, bait fish and other types of creatures like crawfish might be getting kicked up a little bit higher than normal. And so this is where baits like crankbaits, spinner baits, and bladed jigs can really do a lot of damage from what I've read, because you're capitalizing on bass who are moving up and starting to feed up for the spawn. They are hunting these waters when things get churned up. So you want to use baits that can replicate that and trigger a reaction strike. Something interesting I've also read about are soft plastics in windy conditions, and moving towards the heavier side of things. Maybe a Carolina rig or a heavier jig in windy conditions. Sometimes I've seen that articles will talk about in windy conditions that bass will, they don't like to be, kicked around a lot by all that churning up of the water. So they'll move to a lower or cover position, so they don't have to work as hard to stay in those cold conditions while they're swimming around. And so a heavy jig or a heavy Carolina rig can help get those bass who are hugging tight to the bottom. Now, we've also been out on those days where there isn't as much wind, but you have more clouds. And cloudy conditions are actually some of the days that I had the best fishing last year. One of the reasons I think bass enjoy cloudy conditions with not as much wind is because they feel more camouflaged. It's also important to remember that the bass is a cold-blooded animal. And so their behavior and their activity is greatly dependent on the temperature of their environment. Now, I'm still learning about the prime conditions that these bass seem to enjoy being in, but from what I've experienced and what I've read, cloudy, overcast with a little bit of chop to no wind can be a really great day for you to go out and find the biggest bass of that week, because for some reason bass just feel like they can really enjoy being in that environment, and they just get to eating. Something to also remember is during cloudy conditions, you're normally working in darker light conditions, and so you want to use baits like spinner baits or something that has a little bit of flash on it. I remember watching one of the World Series of Fishing videos where I think it was Tim DeSmit was using a tiny little underspin. There was a little bit of chop on that day, a little bit of wind, to a lot of bit of wind, but he was doing really well with that underspin with a little bit of flash on those cloudy conditions. I also remember seeing Jesse Brinkert using a spinner bait and having a lot of success with that. And also, I think it was Matt Long during that competition was using a jerk bait to capitalize on the fish that were hunting for that kind of flash, that quick movement, that reaction strike. So those are some baits that I would use, cloudy conditions with a little bit to no chop. Now, some weather during the springtime can be great. I mean, you've got sunny, bright conditions. You're feeling great in your t-shirt. You're going out there and you're expecting to smash them. But sometimes those can be the hardest days. We all hear about those bluebird skies with that sun high. Can make things really difficult. I think part of the reason that fishing during a sunny, bright day can be difficult is because those conditions really illuminate the water and make your bait very visible. And so your bait has to be very well tuned in order to trick fish into really taking a swing at it. On bright, clear days, make sure that you're using very natural presentations and maybe even have to drop down into the more of the finesse world. These are also days where matching the hatch will come in handy. Stephen Galloway is really, really good at matching the hatch, and he'll sometimes post about what he was catching fish on or show you the bait fish that he found or whatever the fish was eating alongside the bait that he's using. And more often than not, on those really nice days, you'll see him using this technique of matching the hatch. If fish are on bluegill, if fish are on crawfish, it's very evident that he's very, very good at matching the hatch and having big results with it. Some of the baits that I would be throwing during this time on a nice, clear, sunny day would be swim baits, swim jigs, and other natural kind of looking baits. And that also includes jigs. On these really nice, bright days, fish don't have eyelids, right? So is that true? I've heard that fish don't have eyelids, and I've seen that Instagram post about fish being in like a kid pool and where they want to go kind of naturally. They'll take a picture of like a kid pool that's just open and the fish are all kind of just swimming around, but then they put like some rock in that, they put some shade on that, they put a little log in there, and the fish, they take a picture and the fish have automatically kind of naturally gone to these different areas. So, use a jig, but on Those really sunny days, look for that cover, look for those docks, look for those laydowns. Fish don't want to be kind of out in the open on those really clear days because everything is very visible, everything's illuminated, the light is shining down. Water can sometimes be clear because on those days it's very calm. So they need ambush points. So go check some of those docks, go check some of those laydowns, maybe even a drop off, and look for those different, maybe if you find grass, maybe you'll have more luck on those days looking for those ambush points than on a windy day when they're kind of cruising around and capitalizing on water that's been kicked up and bait fish that are being moved around by the wind. So we've talked about our windy days, sometimes they're colder days. We've talked about our cloudy and overcast days, and we've talked about our sunny and clear sky days. But all of these days are connected into the weather and how that weather is changing the conditions day to day. And you can start to predict that if you see a cold front coming in, you know, in a sense, what might be happening to fish behavior, but also when that nice day will come or when that optimal day will come for you to go out and fish. So one of the things that I learned about and I'm still learning about is how cold fronts impact fishing conditions. It's something I heard about and something I feel like I experimented with during the Michigan Big Bass bracket last year, but it's still something I want to understand and capitalize on if I can. So what happens when a storm starts moving in is the barometric pressure drops, and the bass can feel this change in barometric pressure. And when that barometric pressure drops, there's less pressure in the water, and fish can move around in the water easier. This also means that moving around and hunting for bait doesn't use as much energy as it would during a day when the pressure is high and the water pressure is harder to cut through. After that storm leaves, the barometric pressure rises and the water becomes more dense. Fish feel that, and it's harder to move around in the water for them, and so they become less active. And it can feel like these fish have just shut down. We've all been there when we feel like the fish have slowed down, they're much less aggressive, and they're just not feeding like they used to during the storm or even before the storm. So the lesson that I've learned is when a storm is coming in, be ready to capitalize on that feeding frenzy that happens when fish feel barometric pressure dropping, the water density becomes less, and they're able to move around much easier so that they can find bait. That's also to say, know your limits. You shouldn't be going out and targeting storms. Don't go out in lightning. Don't go out in conditions that you don't feel safe in. So just be smart. When a storm is coming in, oftentimes you can feel that change yourself in the air. That might be a great time to go fishing. During a storm, you could go fishing, but really know your limits. After the storm, go fishing, but know that there's a difference between those times. Also in the spring, remember that the name of the game is moving baits. Bass are feeding up for the spawn, so make sure you're using spinner baits, crank baits, swim jigs in order to capitalize on the feeding frenzy during a storm. Now, after that storm leaves, the barometric pressure rises, the water density increases. What bait should you use? This is often a time when we think that fish are just shutting down, but you can trigger them. Like I said, Polenz was catching smallmouth in the snow, which is like the worst conditions I could ever think of fishing in. But I would be willing to bet that he did it using baits that move much slower. Maybe this is a drop shot, a Texas rig plastic moving very, very slow, kind of a finesse jig presentation. Now we'll talk about smallmouth another time, but the point being is after that storm moves away and that barometric pressure rises, the water density increases and you'll have to slow down. You can trigger bass probably during this. Again, bass don't follow a rule book. You probably always catch one on a chatterbait or a crankbait, but the majority of them, from what I've read, you want to slow down. So last and certainly not least, remember to use this information about how weather impacts fishing conditions and pair it with some of the things we've already talked about. Your map study, your Google Maps and satellite study, and then apply it to a practice day. If you know, for example, that a storm is coming in, you're going to have cloudy, overcast conditions, there's some wind but not much, and you know that your lake has a nice flat next to some deep water, you should go check that out. If you know that you're post-frontal and the conditions have cooled off a little bit, and you know, for example, that they were eating pretty good on flats and maybe ledges the day before, during the storm, or even before the storm, maybe go try some of this slow moving presentation, drop shots and slow moving soft plastics, just kind of dragging them around, and see how that impacts your fishing. All of that in your practice will help you have a better season when it comes to tournament fishing. Again, last year I feel very lucky to have had the opportunity to be runner-up in the big brass bracket, but what I was actually doing during that time was tinkering around and trying to figure out pre-spawn patterns, because it was something that I didn't know much about and wanted to learn more about. And I started to kind of figure out that right before a storm just seemed to be the best day for me. And I would really make sure that I had time to look at a weather map and look at the 10-day forecast and know during my week that Thursday was going to be the day before a storm with not much wind, but a little bit of wind. Those were the days that I would target and go out. Sometimes I would go out during a storm. And sometimes during the weekend, I wouldn't go out at all because I just knew it would be too difficult for me. And I had already caught a fish on that Thursday before the storm. So try out some of these tactics this season. Again, I'm not saying that this is the way. And fish, from what I've learned, never really followed the rule book. Most of the things I've learned have come from videos and articles. So there is a trend here. There is some research behind why certain days seem to be better than others. I spend a lot of time researching and looking at articles and watching videos in order to try to learn this information and then use it in my applications. And it did me pretty well last year. But there's always that fish that doesn't follow the rules. There's always that time that you're going to catch your biggest bass or your PB bass, and you'll have no idea really why it was there. It was just the right time, the right place, and you were just there for that perfect moment, which is awesome. And I definitely have fish catches from last year that I'm still not too sure why fish were there or why I won a tournament, but I'm telling you, there really isn't any better feeling than putting everything you've learned together into a winning pattern. Be it, putting everything you've learned in terms of weather, map study, pre-fishing, practice, some of that dock talk, and going out and being successful. It's amazing when you feel like you know exactly what's going on and you're perfectly tuned into all of that nature and all of that beauty in order for you to be successful on the water. So hopefully you have that feeling this year. Go out and try some of these tactics that we've talked about. I'm so excited that the tournament season is back, and I hope you all have a great season. Until next time, see you later.